Okay, I'm really glad that you've joined us for us to discuss what we call the building blocks of disciple making. This is really the biblical basis of every man a warrior, and it's important for us to unpack this as we move forward. One of the things that we know in our society today is that there's no lack of resources for us. When we're asking the question, what should we do to build men? There's plenty of books that we can go get that are written by good, godly men that can help us. But if those are the answer, we should expect at this point to see some really good results. Unfortunately, in the church today, from statistics we've been getting for the last 5, 10, even 20 years, men in the church aren't looking much different than men outside the church. And so if that's the case, a pretty obvious thought might be if we're going to get different results, we've got to do something different. Well, at Every Man a Warrior, we think that what we really need to do is back up and go look at the original intent and how we were to be discipled. And we want to do that with you by looking in the New Testament at the two key figures in disciple making, of course, Jesus and the Apostle Paul. So what do we learn from Jesus? Well, we know that his last command to us was very clear that we had a job to do. We were called to go and make disciples, and we're to teach them to obey everything that we've commanded. So we've got an important role there. The Apostle Paul kind of upped the ante on that when he said that we were not only just to lay a foundation, but we're to do it as expert builders. Lonnie, who wrote the Every Man a Warrior series, says this is a verse that kept him up at night because as you go further into that scripture, it tells us that some build with wood, hay, and straw, while others build with gold, silver, and precious jewels. But at the end, all that's going to get tested by fire to see what still stands. Well, men, this means that we get to decide what we value in how we develop men, how we become expert builders of men. We learned that from Proverbs 16:9 that tells us that the heart of man plans his ways, but the Lord directs his steps. And the way I read that when I've had quiet times on that scripture is that this is really God's invitation for us to partner with him. And part of that for us is we get to decide how we're going to build into men, what tools we're going to use. So now, as we begin to develop our building blocks of discipleship, we want to see what Jesus taught his disciples during his ministry. The first thing we think we need to look at is Matthew 22:36-38, where Jesus is asked, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment." So Jesus gave this a priority, the first, and he also gave it a qualification that it was the greatest for us to develop our love relationship with God. So that's the first building block that we're going to put into our building blocks of discipleship. Next in Jesus' ministry, we see a couple different things that are just hallmarks of how Jesus lived his life. The first was that Jesus was a man of the Word. We know in John 8:31 that Jesus says, "If you abide in my word, you're truly my disciples." So it's very important if a man's going to grow into this relationship with God and with Jesus, that he becomes a man of the Word as well. And so we want to teach basic skills, things like memorization and meditation on the Word to help a man grow. The next thing we see in Jesus' ministry is a clear focus on prayer. Not only do we see Jesus consistently getting off on his own so that he can spend personal time with the Father, he told us that he didn't do or say anything that the Father didn't tell him to do. We also see him taking his disciples off in smaller groups so that they can be a part of prayer with him. So he modeled that for them. And of course, he gave us the ultimate model for prayer of the Lord's Prayer. So these three building blocks are really about building our intimate relationship with God. And these are the core foundations that we have to have if a guy is going to develop intimacy with God, which we believe is the foundation of a fruitful life. So there's the first basic foundation of these building blocks. We'll return in the second video when you come to join me. We're going to unpack more of what Paul teaches us through his ministry.